Hello again and welcome to another edition of the CAI Report. I'm Mike Livingston, your host, and I'm the current president of the Coachella Valley chapter of CAI. Another informative show for you here today. Joining me is longtime attorney in our chapter, Mary Howell from the firm of Epstein, Grinnell and Howell. Mary, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mike.
Mary has been a great guest on our show before. I know some of you recognize her from being the attorney in some of your homeowners associations here in the Valley and all down the West Coast. She's published. She appears on shows like this. She speaks at many seminars and conferences and whatnot. So very possible that you've seen her before. I'm glad we got to rustle up a little bit of her time here because we're going to talk about something very important, something that is no association, be it 10 units, 300 units, are immune from, and that is something relative to architectural control guidelines and what have you. Mary, one thing that we deal with in common interest developments is, and it's right in the title there, is common. A lot of times people don't realize that when they move into a common interest development, they think, wow, I'm moving into a gated community. Look at all these positives I get from moving into these places. And they don't realize that although they get a lot of pluses, there is a little bit of personal freedoms, if you will, taken away from them in what they can do and what they can't do. And I'm not just talking about the pink lawn flamingos or what have you, but they can't just go do whatever they want in these places to their home, can they?
No, they can't. One of the local judges put it very well in a case I'm aware of. He said, it's true that beauty, architecturally speaking, is in the eye of the beholder, but when you move into one of these common interest developments, you lose the right to be the beholder, which I thought was a pretty good summary of it.
Interesting.
Many cases and commentators have pointed out that one of the freedoms that you give up when you move into a common interest development is the right to decide for yourself what changes you will make, at least to the exterior of your property. Falls under the general heading of architectural control. We found in our firm's practice that architectural issues are probably, at this point, the most prevalent basis for litigation. Either litigation by the association to enforce its architectural restrictions, or litigation started by a homeowner who objects to the way in which architectural guidelines are interpreted by the association.
I find that to be a shame, and I'll tell you, one of the things that I have found, having been the board president of my own HOA for such a long time and being a manager in this industry for 16 years, it's frustrating from a point where I understand it, human nature being what it is. At the same time, I think a lot of it stems from, and I don't want to use the word ignorance, but just a lack of knowledge. When you buy a home in a common interest development, there is a large process, not unlike the purchase of a home anywhere else. However, there's a myriad of documents that you get. And obviously anybody that's buying a home is very, very excited about that. And so they're signing papers and they're writing checks and they're doing this and that. And a lot of time, one of the forms that they sign during that process is that they have read the governing documents, the CC&Rs, the bylaws, the architectural guidelines, right? And that they agree to them. And they sign that form very quickly sometimes. Most of the time, I would say, or guess, they haven't read those, even though they have signed a form saying that they've read them and that they will abide by them.
Similarly, you could say read them and weep. Well, in this case, it's don't read them and weep. Frankly, you're bound by the documents, whether you've read them or whether you haven't read them. I find not only is it a problem for homeowners who fail to read and appreciate those restrictions before they move in, but it may also be a problem for the enforcing party, the board or the architectural review committee. We found on a number of occasions that they're somewhat derelict in their duty to be aware of their own documents, and they'll assert, oh, everybody knows that's a rule. Well, it isn't a rule. Or it's an unwritten rule, and I think those are very dangerous. One of the big pieces of advice I always give to architectural review committees and boards is commit those guidelines, those aesthetic norms, which are hard to define and articulate. Figure out how to define and articulate them and put them down in writing so that you can't be accused of selectively enforcing or interpreting.
Well, just so that they're there in case they're ever challenged.
Correct. Correct. And so that a homeowner moving in, as you point out, at least if he or she takes the time to read those guidelines, has a pretty good idea of what is likely to be permitted within the community and what is completely out of the ordinary.
So I think a lot of times when people move into these developments and they find a problem, again, like I said, ignorance, I think it's something that the one thing that I want the people to take away from this program, and I think you already said it, but I want to make sure that we're clear on it. When you move into a common interest development, you are bound by those documents, and you are in fact obligated to follow what's in those documents, and it is common.
Yes, you are obligated to follow what's in the documents, but even more importantly, you're obligated to give way to the aesthetic judgment, typically, of an architectural committee or a design review committee or an environmental control committee. These committees are vested with a great deal of discretion, and provided they don't act arbitrarily or capriciously, they're entitled to interpret the documents and dictate to you what you may and may not do with the exterior of your property.
Now, most of us are pretty familiar with the terms CC&Rs and bylaws. Separate, part and parcel to that, we have another document usually called the Architectural Guidelines. Let's go into that a little bit.
Architectural guidelines are a form of rules and regulations. They may be generated by the board of directors, by the architectural review committee, or occasionally even by the developer, who will leave a nice little set when the development phase is over saying these are the architectural or design guidelines. Though, because they are rules as opposed to bylaws or CC&Rs, they can be amended by the board without necessarily the consent of the homeowners as a whole. To amend the CC&Rs or bylaws, you have to have owner consent. But the rules and regulations, architectural guidelines and so forth, can typically be changed by the board or the architectural review committee. And that's frankly a good thing because it allows for some flexibility. Neighborhoods change, desirable exteriors change over time. So it's good to be able to alter those to keep up with the times. The checks and balances involved nowadays when a board proposes to change a rule, it must notice the members that it's going to change the rule and give the members an opportunity for feedback to the board. But yeah, that's the difference. Your CC&Rs are recorded, your rules and regulations, including guidelines, much more flexible, not recorded. You are nevertheless bound by them.
Right.
Whether you've read them or not, you are bound by them. But there is more flexibility if the community wishes to change those.
Right, I wanted to make sure that people were aware of that. Even though they're not recorded, you are still bound by them. And a lot of times I don't think people even realize that they're there.
I think that's true, but I also believe that the purchasing public is becoming more and more aware. A corollary to that is we're getting a rash of calls from managers who are contacted by potential purchasers saying, well, now I want to do this and this and this and this with my property. Is the architecture review committee going to allow it? The answer is don't say a word. You should not make advisory opinions or render advisory opinions. If and when that person actually purchases a property, becomes a member of the community, and submits an accurate, fully detailed application as to what he or she wishes to construct, then and only then is the committee in a position to say whether or not that would be allowed.
You know, that's funny because I've gotten a few of those myself on some of the developer calls, and it's almost like we're asked to guess into the future.
Render an advisory opinion. Don't do that.
I certainly don't want to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in general when we come back. Stay with us. Mary Howell is my guest today on the CAI Report.
CAI Report is brought to you by Bright & Clean Windows. Trust Southern California's favorite window cleaning company to provide consistent, quality window cleaning service to your home and office. Let Bright & Clean Windows make you look great by removing hard water stains from windows and shower door enclosures and by cleaning windows and mirrors to a gleaming shine. Call 346-9274. High-rise living in the desert. Located at the corner of Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope Drives is the Desert Island Condominium Community. 226 luxury homes within 3 buildings on an island surrounded by a 25-acre lake. Come find out why high-rise living is so enjoyable. Call 760-324-1871.
Hey Tim, what's this I hear about your sponsorship with CAI doing so well?
My sponsorship in the television show?
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, it's one of the best things I've done for the CAI, besides being a volunteer, that is.
Yeah?
Yeah.
So is it helping you?
Well, it's helping me and it's helping my bottom line. I'm getting customers and making money.
What a great opportunity.
Yeah.
And you can have that opportunity too. Give a call to the CAI office so you can be a sponsor on our CAI report. The telephone number is 760-341-0559. Hello, Stephen Shuey here. I want to interrupt this program for just a minute before we go back to our regular show and talk to you, boards of directors members, just for a brief few minutes about something very important to you, and that is the hiring of licensed and insured contractors. It's extremely important when you're working in a homeowners association that all of the people who come to work on your property for the association are licensed and insured. You know, you can save money in some places in the budget, but you don't want to save money when it comes to a choice between one contractor or another. One's licensed, one's not, or one's insured and one's not. You really need to have licensed and insured contractors. The saving of a few dollars is not going to be worth it in the long run. Those people who have saved money because the party wasn't a licensed contractor have found that they end up with a job that's not quite satisfactory. It looks beautiful when it's first finished, but it doesn't last near as long as that job that might have cost a few more dollars and been done by a licensed contractor. The same thing applies to insured contractors. Wouldn't it be awful if somebody you hired, say, to do tree trimming had fallen out of a tree and hurt themselves badly, and you come to find out they didn't have proper insurance? The association ends up paying for a long time to come. It's critically important. Always hire licensed and insured contractors. Thank you. Now back to our show.
And we're back, Mike Livingston and you, on the CAI Report. Thank you for joining us again. Mary Howell is my guest from the firm of Epstein, Grinnell and Howell. Glad to have you again, Mary.
Pleasure to be here again.
Okay, we are talking today about architectural guidelines in common interest developments and some of the issues that arise because of architectural guidelines. Common, not common, how do we go about it? What are the issues that arise there? Mary, before the break, one of the things we talked about were the differences between governing documents and where the architectural guidelines fall into place in a common interest development. Let's say a homeowner is now in and they are aware that there are architectural guidelines and they want to make a change to their residence. They want to paint their house in one of the 4 acceptable color schemes of that association. How do they go about doing that?
Well, it can vary association to association depending on their established procedure. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you to talk about some of the procedures that you've observed. Typically, however, there's a written application pursuant to some set guidelines that the particular association has established. The legislature thought it was very important that homeowners know how an architectural application must be submitted and further what kinds of things required it. So a year ago they passed Civil Code Section 1378, which amongst other things requires associations now to have a written procedure in place telling homeowners how to make those applications, talking about how a denied application can be appealed to the board in some circumstances, and requiring the Architectural Control Committee, if it denies, to specify each and every basis upon which the denial was made. Having said that, again, it depends very much on the particular community. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of the procedures or what's typical in most of the associations that you manage? Well,
that's interesting. I think in some cases a lot of these things differ when you say most cases. At Personalized Property Management, I handle a lot of what we call the elite clients. Being the director of management, I'm kind of overseeing the other managers in our firm as far as portfolios. However, I do like to keep a portfolio myself so that I'm up to date with the day-to-day issues in the management world. That being said, some of the elite clients that we're dealing with, as you might imagine, we're dealing with a demographic of both affluence and monetary value in these communities that are a little bit different than the norm. So some of the architectural issues or things that would come up would be different from, I'm going to paint my house. And in these cases, I'd like to build a $2 million addition to my residence. But in general, the whole process, when broken down in an elementary fashion, would actually basically come to the same point. There are still documents, there is still a process, and there would still be a number one, an application to be drawn based on that. And in a lot of cases, like I said, with the value and the complexities of the projects to be done, there would be blueprints drawn or what have you to lay out the full complexities of what they're proposing to be done. Some of these properties actually have consulting architects that they deal with to guide that architectural committee through the process of really breaking down whether that particular project is going to conform with their architectural guidelines.
I'm assuming that you also typically require certain security payments, and the guidelines should address that. Construction payment deposit to make sure that work is performed and the space is cleaned up and there's no damage to the common area. How do your associations typically handle the issue where you have both the association permitting process and then you have the city or county permitting process as well? So very often you'll have the application come first to the association, and then after the association approves it, it goes to the city or the municipality, which may request changes be made. Now, I would assume that the forward-thinking association would provide in its rules that if there are any changes required by the city or the county, that it has to come back again to the Architectural Review Committee so that the Architectural Review Committee can say, gee, that's just fine by us, or man, that is not what we had in mind. Do your associations handle that?
In this particular instance, I have obviously one particular association in my mind that I'm talking about or thinking about, which I won't say the name simply because
good call.
I wouldn't do that. But in this particular instance, that particular property deals with not only a security deposit but also a fee. In this particular case, a $7,500 security deposit and a $2,500 fee, which helps pay the cost of the consulting architect, which sometimes it goes back and forth to that architect a couple of different times. In this particular case of this particular association, that architect, after the first, or the submitting builder, homeowner, and their architect are responsible after the first review for getting city approval and thus making that part of their submission. So that is taken off of the layman, as it were, Architectural Review Committee.
I guess the point I wanted to make is you want to have something in place in your documents that lets the association have a last look at a changed document or a changed set of plans so they can say, yeah, that's okay, or no, that's not. The one other thing that a lot of documents overlook, and is becoming increasingly a problem as money tightens up, is delays in completing construction. You probably want to add to your documents, if you don't already have it, some deadlines for how long it should take for construction to be completed on, say, a minor or a major improvement. Do you find that's typical in your associations?
I do, and again, I think that is directly relative to the size and scale of the project that we're talking about. A painting project of somebody's house is one thing, or the changing of a garage door is another, and the construction of a complete wing of a house may be a different thing. We're going to continue to talk about architectural guidelines and issues that come up in HOAs. Mary Howell is my guest, and stay with us.
Diamond Fusion, a patented award-winning technology that transforms ordinary shower glass and porcelain into low-maintenance surfaces, used by manufacturers like DuPont and by homeowners and resorts to maintain a clean image and save money while making life easier by making cleaning easier. Call 773-2825.
Communication is the key to successful homeowner association management. BestHOA.com specializes in creating websites that serve as the ultimate in communication tools. Taking advantage of technology to help association managers and board members efficiently and promptly deliver information is what BestHOA.com does best. Call BestHOA.com.
Whoa, check out the action on the net.
No, Oscar, stay away from the net.
Not net, internet.
Wow, it's so fast.
That's because it's Roadrunner high-speed internet service. It blows everything else away.
Hello, what's that?
All right, he's looking for another fish.
Ooh, click buy, click buy.
So, you're from eBay.
Is that anywhere near Chesapeake Bay?
Hello, I'm Stephen Shuey. I want to talk to you just for a few moments about the budget process. You know, if you're on the board of directors for your homeowners association, setting that budget's a pretty critical thing, I know. It's a kind of a fine line between making the budget right for your homeowners who never want to see increases and having a budget that's set correctly so you can afford to get the jobs done you need to have done. My recommendation is set the budget correctly for the jobs you want to have done. Your homeowners will be happy. They may groan a little bit at the first sight of an increase, but in the long run, you need to have increases to keep up with the cost of living. Do what's right.
And we're back on the CAI Report. Thank you for staying with us. Huge topic today is architectural guidelines and enforcement. Mary Howell with the firm of Epstein, Grinnell & Howell is with me. I'm Mike Livingston, your host and the current president of the Coachella Valley chapter of CAI, Community Associations Institute. Mary, again, thank you for joining us. We're glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
Good. Architectural guidelines and the problems that come with life in a common interest development. Again, beauty in the eye of the beholder, and living in one, as you said, can sometimes be, you can lose your...
Your right to be the beholder.
Your right to be the beholder, to quote a judge. Okay, early on you said that, and I agree with this as a longtime manager, it seems as though the biggest issue in today's day and age in common interest developments when it comes to litigation stems or arises from, in one way or another, architectural issues one way or another. Tell us about that.
I'm often called on to try and do a little bit of preventative lawyering, teach classes to architectural review committees and boards about how they can avoid being sued, either by homeowners who got their applications rejected or by neighbors who don't like an application which was approved. It's kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't. Mm-hmm. But I have developed a kind of a list of preventative measures that I think associations ought to be aware of in order to minimize the risk of liability. First and foremost, and it seems so basic, it's know the documents. You'd be surprised at the number of boards and architectural review committees that don't, at the outset, sit down and take a very close look at their documents. Remember, if it's an architectural guideline, too, that the board can change it. It doesn't have to stay the same. Court decision out of the East Coast says, just because you approved 10 bad homes doesn't mean that you have to prove the 11th bad home. Presumably you learn by your mistakes. So know your documents, be able to cite to what provision you're relying on if there's a particular point in question, like a setback or a height limitation.
I think that's a key point to make.
Absolutely.
Don't keep repeating the same mistake just because you made it once.
Exactly. Written guidelines are important. Very often the CC&Rs will only say something like, a view will not be unreasonably obstructed. Well, you know, the R word, reasonable, is open to debate. If it's possible to establish in writing what you consider to be a view corridor or a reasonable protection for a view or a height limitation, do it. Employ professional consultants. You would be surprised. We've got an all-volunteer committee, an all-volunteer board. They often lack the professional expertise to evaluate architectural applications. There is no harm and indeed much benefit to be derived from retaining occasionally an architect or a contractor from outside to advise people on the aesthetic norms and what that will actually look like, what the change will actually look like when constructed. Consider asking the owner to erect story poles if there's an issue about a view impairment so that you can actually see the dimensions of the house that's going to be built. You can hire now CAD or computer-assisted drafting or drawing to give you a pictorial depiction of a three-dimensional look-see at what the view impact is going to be. Another issue is documenting your decisions. Everybody laughs about the paper trail, but the paper trail is critical. You have to be able to say when an application was received, and by the way, I recommend that when an application comes in, typically to the management company, that it be signed on each and every page. So you have 1 of 10, 2 of 10, 3 of 10, 4 of 10, that it actually says that and it's stamped on the date received. To avoid a process called, I'm told by architects, slip sheeting, where you go in, you take a sheet of plans down, you get the approval, and then somebody comes in and sticks extra sheets in after the approval is gotten. To avoid that, you want to make sure that every single page of the application or the plans is stamped in as received.
Thankfully, that hasn't happened to me. I didn't realize that was going on. That's an interesting point.
Documenting variances. Occasionally the board, or excuse me, the ARC is going to want to deviate from established norms, and they typically have the right to do so in the governing documents. But if you're going to grant a variance, you need architectural committee to be able to say why you did it. Was topographical? Was it no view impairment in question? What was the reason you decided to deviate from the norm? You need to document it. Also, if you're planning to grant a variance, a deviation, consider whether you shouldn't put other adjoining neighboring homeowners on notice of your intent to potentially grant a variance. And you may want to establish a rule like all neighbors within 500 feet or 600 yards or whatever the case may be will be put on notice. That's easier than saying adjoining or nearby, which are flexible terms. Prompt, documented decisions. Again, I want to emphasize 1378 says if you are going to deny an architectural application, you must state each and every basis upon which that application has been denied, and that must be contained in the material that goes back to the applicant homeowner. Those are critical issues. I think if you observe those, you stand a pretty good chance of covering yourself in a case of litigation.
So simply the board member saying, I just don't like what you're proposing, that's not good enough, is it?
That's no longer good enough. No longer good enough. One other issue that we are occasionally asked to comment on is, suppose you've got an outstanding violation. It's been there a while. Old board didn't care about it. New board comes in and says, I am sick and tired of the pink flamingos or something of that nature. And I'm often asked, can we do anything about that? That is a case-by-case analysis, but some of the more important issues are, is it a big ticket item? Did it cost the homeowner an awful lot of money to make it happen? How long ago did it happen? The longer it is, the harder it will be to remove it. And usually the more expensive it was, the harder it will be to have a court force its removal.
Sure.
On that note, though, there's a brand new good case called the Woodridge case, which concerned an architectural review committee that gave approval even though the item was prohibited in the documents. And the court held that because it was very clear in the documents that that shouldn't have been approved, the fact that the architectural review committee mistakenly approved it did not prevent its removal. So it's a great case.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. Well, again, we could probably sit here and talk about architectural issues all day, and I know how important, having managed for as long as I have, how important these issues are because of a lot of the things you just said. I would think, most associations do not, based on their budgets or their size or what we're dealing with, do not employ professional architects or what have you to be consultants.
And they probably should.
But that's something that I think may be a wave of the future.
Very good.
Mary Howell with the firm of Epstein, Grinnell & Howell. Thank you for joining us today, Mary.
Pleasure as always. Thank you, Michael.
Love to have you, and we'd like to have you again soon, I'm sure. Stay with us. Come back with us again to the CAI Report. I'm Mike Livingston. We'll see you next time.